Let's then get into the story of Demolition Man, the 1990. Oh gosh, the 19. That's a great start, isn't it? The 1993 movie that stars Sylvester Stallone, Wesley Snipes. You get Sandra Bullock, Nigel Hawthorne, Dennis Leary in there as well. Directed by Marco Brambilla. In the end, the screenplay credited to, let me read this, Daniel Waters, Robert Renault, Peter M. Lenkoff, from a story by Peter M. Lenkoff and Robert Renault. Among the producers, Joel Silver, that name is fairly important to the story that we're about to go through. So let's go. I mean, Sylvester Stallone, when we get to him in 1993, is in a bit of a different position to how we know him now. That his career had been faltering off the back of a couple of comedy movies. There was Oscar, there was Stop or My Mum Will Shoot. The Rocky V hadn't done well either, and he was in something of a box office lull. So he roared back with 1993's Cliffhanger, but also the same year came Demolition Man. It wasn't originally set for him, though. So let's go right the way back to the name of one of those writers I mentioned. The writer concerned, Peter Lemkoff. Now, he went on the Smoking Tire podcast and he took in his diary. And in his diary, he notes on April the 17th, 1988, that was a crucial turning point in the Demolition Man story. The film got noticed because he'd started writing this as a spec script in late 1987, partly just to try and get an agent. I mean, he was working just in and around the industry, but he was looking to get the next break. And so he wrote it over that Christmas. And in April 1988, he'd sold it, and he'd sold it to Carolco. Now, Carolco in the late 1980s, a huge independent company. It had made Rambo 3, the most expensive film in the world. It was going to make Total Recall. It was going to make Terminator 2 Judgment Day, the most expensive film in the world. It's one of the biggest majors, independent major studios of that era in Hollywood. So Carolco was interested. Carolco wanted it. And Lenkoff's career was turned around overnight. He admitted that once you've sold an expensive spec script, the offers start coming in, and suddenly he was getting a lot of attention from Hollywood. He was also, though, working as an assistant within the industry when he sold the script. And so this led to some legal shenanigans that, again, were a turning fork in the Demolition Man story, because he explained on the aforementioned podcast that he wrote Demolition Man in evenings and at weekends, but he would get into work really early, he'd leave really late, but he would use, on some occasions, their electric typewriter, not in working hours, but still, it was their equipment. And so his employers at that point said, well, you were working for us, you used our equipment, it's ours, we have the rights to it. And so legal action came in, and it was this really that led to, let's just say, one or two executive producer credits of people who weren't massively involved in the film. But anyway, he'd sent the script out originally. He hadn't put it in his own name. He'd put it in the name of his license plate number. And that was just like a little trick, because he just thought, well, if people are vaguely intrigued and they don't see a name, they just see a code number, it might at least get them talking. And that worked, because then the conversations were started. People were interested. Who is this mysterious writer? I mean, by the time he'd done with all of this, it was known who the writer was. He would go on to do 12, 15 drafts himself, or something along those lines for Demolition Man. But the crucial thing was the script sold. The problem was Carolco then dropped out when there was legal confusion. Let's just put that in inverted commas. Legal confusion over the ownership of the screenplay. So one of the people that Lemkoff managed to get to was Hollywood producer Joel Silver. Joel Silver of Die Hard, of Lethal Weapon, big bombastic 80s movies, a very huge personality in 80s Hollywood as well, and early 90s Hollywood. The telling story about Joel Silver, told this lots of times over the years, is that when Who Framed Roger Rabbit needed some shouty, angry Hollywood producer and they couldn't find an actor to get the role, they just got Joel Silver in to do it, and you see him near the start of that movie for that reason. So Silver and Lemkoff were working together on a couple of TV things, but eventually Silver was interested in Demolition Man, and with Carolco relinquishing its hold over the project, he got it, was able to take it to Warner Brothers, and so here we were. The film was now up and running. It was, I mean, there was still quite a lot of work to do at this point, not least who'd you get to direct it. I mean, if Joel Silver's producing, he had a habit of getting directors with not many credits, just so you could perhaps say he would have a degree more control over the process. And the director of Demolition Man was then in his late 20s, a man called Marco Brambilla, who to this date has directed, I think it's one feature film. He'd done a few short films at this point, but I mean, tellingly, when he got the job, he got a gift from Tony Scott, who'd previously worked with Joel Silver, and he sent Brambilla a toy gun with a little note saying, "You'll understand later." Brambilla explained how the job came to him in an interview he did many years later with The Talk. And apparently we've got David Fincher to thank for this. So David Fincher, where was he at this stage? Well, he hadn't made was he just directing Alien 3? Probably just about to embark on it. He hadn't made his directorial feature debut, but obviously was a big name in the world of commercials and advertising. And so Silver was interested in working with David Fincher, but Fincher wasn't available. Fincher and Brambilla were friends, and so David Fincher put in the recommendation to Joel Silver, try Marco Brambilla. And I mean, as Brambilla explained, the films I was making, I'm reading it here, was when I was in my early teens, were all experimental tone films and visual things. So when I was seduced by Hollywood, it was an interesting way to work on a big scale with a lot of resources. Well, the drafts were continuing and continuing and continuing. The film it would come to Sylvester Stallone, but it's worth noting it wasn't actually written with him in mind. That if you go back to Peter Lemkoff, who's been in the news for less nice reasons of late, he'd written it originally with Mickey Rourke was in his head, but I mean that wasn't set to be. But I mean by that point you're then looking at all the big action stars of the era. Jean-Claude Van Damme, he's a possible. Steven Seagal was a possible as well. And so I mean we're looking there. It got to a point where a draft was written with Steven Seagal actually involved. That Seagal had an office on the Warner Brothers lot at the time, and Seagal and Lemkoff would work on the script together. I mean, there's stories that Arnold Schwarzenegger was interested at that point. Mel Gibson was perhaps interested at that point, but it had been written by Rourke. The influence had been the writing of Shane Black. I mean, the first Lethal Weapon film remains a screenplay that's a delight to actually just sit and read. That it's often said about screenplays that they are the least read piece of writing for mass market entertainment, you know? But you can sit and read the Lethal Weapon script and have a great time just reading it. He'd also he also loved cop movies as well. And Lemkoff also was, I think he was just queuing for groceries or something like that. And he just saw a story about how Walt Disney's body had allegedly been cryogenically frozen so that many years later he could be de-thawed and would come out. Throw in then the song with the lyric "Don't Mess with the Demolition Man." I think it was Sting that did that, and there were the ingredients that basically formed the basis of the script. Here, Lemkoff in the end was one of many writers who came on board, and I mean when Sylvester Stallone would then come on board, he would have ideas as well. That Lemkoff would credit Sylvester Stallone with the idea of the sequence in the film where a VR headset is used to simulate, let's just say, mattress maneuvers. We'll go with that. There was also, I mean, Daniel Waters, who'd penned Batman Returns for Tim Burton. He'd also done Heathers, of course. He came in to work on the film as well, and he was taking influence from the Woody Allen movie Sleeper. There was a little bit of that thrown into the mix of it, and also even though this was a futuristic film, they were taking influence from the time that they were in. I mean, you go to something like Spielberg's Minority Report, and it's said that when they were doing the production design for Minority Report, again it's a fairly well-known story, they looked at the buildings that were around us right now, because the argument is in the future we're still going to be living in many of the same buildings, it's just they'll have been redressed a few times. And so it was it had its feet in contemporary times and based a future on that. Seagal was not in Stallone would come in, and then it was who's going to play against him in the role of Simon Phoenix, the antagonist of the piece. And Jackie Chan was right up the list. In fact, he was sounded out about whether he wanted to take on this big Hollywood role in this big Joel Silver, Warner Brothers blockbuster action movie. And the answer was no, he didn't want to play a villain. Wesley Snipes was on the radar for the film, but he turned it down many, many times, goes the story. And in fact, in the end, it got to a point where they went to visit him on the set of a film he was making, Rising Sun, directed by Philip Kaufman, based on the book by Michael Crichton and co-starring Sean Connery. They went to visit him there just to try and convince him. Meanwhile, the physical production build of Demolition Man was ongoing. This would take over an awful lot of Warner Brothers sound stages on its lot in Burbank, California. A 3-story cryo jail from 2032 was being put together. Futuristic cars were being designed. A lot of this they couldn't film on location. They had to build this futuristic look for the film, and build it they did. Wesley Snipes came in late. In the end, he was a late hire on the film after an injury to Sylvester Stallone, which I'm coming to once or twice. But filming began in February of 1993. Now, this was just pushing it incredibly close, because the film was coming out at the end of that year as well. But still, this was the world they were in. It wasn't going to need an absolute ton of post-production work done on it, you would think. Certainly not in terms of special effects and things like that. Stallone would get 10 million. Snipes would get 4 million. The original budget for the film in around the 45 million mark, but it would go up and up and up and up and up. Now, there is an extensive, you can still read it online, Los Angeles Times set report from Demolition Man. There's a terrific one in Empire Magazine's archives as well. And I mean, Warner Brothers was beefing up the publicity for what was turning into a quite expensive film. And I mean, it just reads, whenever you read the set reports on Demolition Man, the centre of gravity is Sylvester Stallone and Joel Silver. That you've got a director there, you've got Wesley Snipes with input, but this is Stallone and Silver as the two centres of power on this script. And so, I mean, the Los Angeles Times report talks about just directing an action scene, and how Stallone is talking about how his hand motion gets a bit frenetic and the pacing is a bit off, not building enough momentum. Brambilla is just saying we can tone it down. And then Stallone blocking out his fights. I mean, Stallone directed far more feature films than Marco Brambilla, and so quite hands-on himself. And I mean, the Los Angeles Times report, I'm just reading, it's just Joel Silver watching, over budget and schedule, coming to that. The brainstorming session for a particular fight continues with Brambilla standing on the sidelines, deferring to the real powers on the set, Stallone and Silver. It did not take long for this film to fall behind schedule. That this was supposed to shoot for 72 days. It would end up shooting well over that, 110 days, 38 days. Over, what's that, more than 50, is that 50%? It's more than 50%. My maths GCSE is serving me well. And I mean, there was just loads of gossip around it. This wasn't even the internet era and the gossip was out there. It's just like, asked how long Demolition Man has been behind schedule, a crew hand says with a laugh. Only since the first week of shooting. It was struggling fast. But then there were these other factors in there. Stallone's injury, again, I mean, he had a pinched vein in his shoulder that slowed things down. But also, Laurie Petty was originally cast as the female lead in the film. That the story was they wanted Sandra Bullock, but Laurie Petty got the role. She lasted 3 days, I think it was, as Lenina Huxley. That Bullock wasn't available. They kept Laurie Petty on standby for about 5-6 weeks. They'd done the costume fittings, the makeup test, and then they just fired her and paid her off. And I mean, Petty didn't sound like she had too many problems with that. She was quoted in Entertainment Weekly as saying, Sly and I were like oil and water, that the two were not particularly getting on. By mid-July, the film was, I mean, it wasn't just running over. It had gone through, I mean, umpteen crew changes as well. It was on its fifth assistant director. Many had to leave Demolition Man because they had commitments to go and make other films. They'd already got bookings. And so, as again, one crew person said, hiring 5 assistant directors has got to be a record. There's probably only a dozen original crew left at the end of the production from a main crew of 160. Joel and Marco, said this person is quoted, don't even know anyone's name anymore. They just yell out grip and gaffer and things like that. It got to the point where Warner Brothers was just concerned about how much this was going over. Now, this was not a film shooting away from the studio either. It wasn't like in Alaska or something like that. This was on the studio's doorstep. It was on its backlot, Demolition Man was shooting. And so it wasn't a case of it had to send an executive halfway around the planet, just had to send them next door. And it did indeed assign a studio executive to try and just keep on top of the overruns that were coming, of the overspending, the fact that it was overschedule as well. And it was Joel Silver who was said to be in control of the budget and also not necessarily in control of the budget. As one crew member said, but I mean, finger pointing was beginning. Marco Brambilla has a great future ahead of him, which he did and has, but not in film, as it turns out. But asking him to direct a huge action film is like teaching someone to drive and entering them into the Indy 500 the next day. And, you know, an Empire set report was just suggesting that it was Silver who was suggesting you need that shot and you need that shot and you need that shot. And Brambilla would reflect sometime later that it wasn't really a director's medium when he was in there. I'll come back to that shortly. Silver was very much, as press came onto the set of Demolition Man, a man on the defensive. And I mean, even while it was filming, he's quoted as saying, I wish you people wouldn't judge the film until after you've seen the finished movie. Why'd you invite them on the set then? And he just said, Terry Semel, then the head of Warner Brothers, the co-head of Warner Brothers, just left me moments ago after seeing the trailer. He was beaming, italicized, beaming. He was so happy. Which leads me on to one person who wasn't beaming, and that's the late, great English actor Nigel Hawthorne. Now, Nigel Hawthorne's career on the stage, exemplary. On British television, known to a generation of people for his superb work in Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. And a brilliant comic performance in that. I mean, one of the greatest of British sitcoms over the last few decades. And so before he passed, he wrote a memoir and he devoted 3 pages of that memoir, which I have on my shelf behind me, to Demolition Man. They were not happy pages. And the reason he ended up on the film in the first place, first of all, Hollywood had a thing in the early 90s for get British actors in to play your villains. You've got Alan Rickman to thank for that, I think. But also there was a play called Shadowlands, which William Nicholson wrote it. I certainly wrote the script for the film. And it's the story of C.S. Lewis. And on stage, Nigel Hawthorne played C.S. Lewis in that. Huge acclaim, a wonderful production by all accounts, recognition, acclaim. When it came to the film version of Shadowlands, and it's a terrific film directed by Sir Richard Attenborough, Nigel Hawthorne didn't get the lead role. That went to Anthony Hopkins, and Hawthorne wanted the lead role. He wanted to play this on the screen. So then he had another hit play written by Alan Bennett, directed by Nicholas Heitner, The Madness of King George III. And then when there were whispers that might then transfer to the screen, Hawthorne didn't want to make the same mistake twice. So he knew he needed some profile on the big screen. Just at that moment, in comes this offer from Hollywood, a big Hollywood blockbuster, and you can play the villain. And, you know, he's quite positive about the script, really, in his memoir as well. He describes it as, quote, a load of old hokum but quite promising with some witty lines. He was reasonably taken too about the futuristic look, just the futuristic tone of the film, and he just felt, not unreasonably I'd suggest, that there was something above your standard by the numbers blockbuster in it. At least there was a pulse in there. There was something fighting to get out. It was a miserable experience, he would write, of making Demolition Man. The egos of the 2 stars was irrepressible. And he said, I'd heard stories of what went on in big studio films, but to see it on a daily basis was something new. And he noted that neither Sylvester Stallone nor Wesley Snipes was interested in him or his background, and that the pair would, quote, keep everybody waiting on the set as a matter of course. Now, Hawthorne spared particular ire for Sylvester Stallone, describing him as someone who, quote, liked to parade around with a large cigar jammed between his lips, cheerfully wisecracking until dragged forcibly away by the ever-indulgent Joel Silver, who dressed in what appears to be brown silk pyjamas. I've got a pair myself. I haven't. When it came to acting opposite Stallone, I mean, he wasn't really a fan. He struggled, and he just said, I just used to watch his lips in the end, and when they stopped moving, I knew it was my time to speak. And I think that's the mechanics as well of an action film, really. Perhaps a little bit unfair on Stallone. But also the script that got him interested, that was changing. It kept changing and changing and changing. And Hawthorne was fairly candid. I mean, he's fairly candid fairly soon about the fact that he hated the experience. And then just to ice the cake for him, turned out he didn't need to make the film anyway, because Alan Bennett had insisted if The Madness of King George III was going to be a film, it would become The Madness of King George, then it was going to be made with Hawthorne starring, Nicholas Hytner directing, as it was. It was Hawthorne's first big screen leading role, Hytner's feature directorial debut, and it got Oscar nominations. Hawthorne made Demolition Man to get to that, hated it, didn't have to do it. One more name just to throw into the mix. Dennis Leary also pops up in Demolition Man, and he did an interview many years afterwards with In Contention, and he said, I got paid a fitload, okay, of money. And he said, I never saw the finished product, but I've seen scenes of it throughout the year. And he said, not only did I get paid a lot of money, but promised I'd come back to this, but Stallone burst a blood vessel during a stunt scene and we got delayed by a month and a half. So we all got paid a penalty on top of that. And he just said it was great. And he has a rant that he delivers in the film, which he wrote himself. And he just said, I had to write that and pass it through their studio system to get it okayed. And it took forever. Block caps. Forever. Filming finally wrapped up very late. The budget reportedly ballooning to about 75 million in July 1993. And there wasn't really a lot of time to get it then ready for the release of the film. That the movie's credited editor is Stuart Baird. A well-known editor for coming in and firefighting and fixing things. He came in and put his cut together. He's credited with doing a lot of work on The Fugitive and helping get that film into shape as well. There was stuff cut out as well, and it's appeared, I think it was a guy called Dewey Graham used to write loads of novelizations of films, and so the subplot, the novel that was written of Demolition Man was based on the screenplay before stuff was cut. So there's a whole subplot with Sylvester Stallone character, John Spartan, his daughter in there. And I mean, Daniel Waters talked about this in an interview with Vulture, and he said, first of all, nobody seems to do the maths that the daughter would be older than Stallone. And he said, we filmed a scene, an actress that I liked, Elizabeth Russio, and she was in this great miniseries with Juliette Lewis called Home Fires. Nobody's ever heard of it, but it's brilliant, he says. So if he's passing on the recommendation, so will I. Anyway, she ends up playing Stallone's daughter. It's a tender scene, and it just stopped the movie dead. They had time to do test screenings of this, and Joel Silver just went, cut it out. And he said, we cut the scene out, and then I tell you, all our first test screenings, everybody thought Sandra Bullock was the daughter. So when they're about to have, the whole audience is a bit, oh no. I should acknowledge that there are 3 seashells in Demolition Man. I think those came from Daniel Waters. When we were in pandemic lockdown times of 2020, the idea of 3 seashells instead of toilet roll was quite alluring at that point, really. Also, there was a lot of product placement to offset, significant product placement to offset the amount of money the film cost. $15 million paid by 2 different firms. One was General Motors, and General Motors launched, according to an Adweek thing I found from 1993, launched a 5 million ad campaign off the back of how its cars were tooled and designed for Demolition Man. And then, of course, there was Taco Bell. Now, I'm here in the UK, and Taco Bell has appeared here now. But in 1993, I went to see Demolition Man on the big screen, had no idea what Taco Bell was. However, it had paid, what, $10 million for a product placement tie-in for its restaurant, as it were. And Taco Bell is it's thus the only surviving restaurant in the world of Demolition Man, and this 15 million sort of offset some of the budget. But outside of America, some territories in Europe had Taco Bell turned into Pizza Hut, owned by the same company. Not the biggest change in the world, but just a small little thing in there. Now the film is just about to come out again, but it's getting its 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray debut from Arrow on the 9th of December here in the UK. I fully expect to see Taco Bell in that. They've not sent me a copy. I have bought a copy. I cannot wait to watch this film again. So, Stallone already had a hit in 1993. Cliffhanger had come out a few weeks before Jurassic Park, had done very well, thank you very much. Stallone back on the map. And so now here he was. What was the release? October the 8th, 1993 in the US, capitalising fast on the Cliffhanger success. We got it in November in the UK. And I mean, the response from critics to Demolition Man was, it was pretty good. I mean, there was a sense that this is more than just your standard Hollywood action blockbuster. That someone had put a shift in, had a go. There was a kind of satirical undercurrent in it, but it was wrestling with a Stallone, Snipes, action, Joel Silver film as well. But the former just about outweighed the latter. I must admit, I went to see Demolition Man opening weekend, had a blast. I still really, really, really enjoy the film. And, the critics wouldn't normally go for a Stallone action film. I think it came out of the reviews pretty well. To the relief of Warner Brothers as well, it came out the box office pretty well as well. So it was released the weekend, let's have a look, of October the 8th to the 10th in the US, 1993. First place, straight in. Looking at the chart here, 14.2 million it opened with. Not bad by October 1993 money. The other openers that weekend, Mr. Jones was in 7th place with 3.1 million. Then you go down to see Hulk Hogan as Mr. Nanny, $1.8 million opening. The number 2 movie was Cool Runnings. That had, that was 8.5 million. Its audience had gone up on its second week. Malice from director Harold Becker was in 3rd place, down from 1st. The Good Son is a really interesting film. It was the film that Macaulay Culkin's father negotiated his son to basically co-star in as part of his Home Alone 2 deal. And it was a film you couldn't see in the UK for a while. I'll come to that at some point. That was in 4th place. The Age of Innocence from Martin Scorsese was at 5th. The Joy Luck Club, 6th. A Bronx Tale, Robert De Niro's directorial debut. Good film, that, in 8th. The Program in 9th. For Love or Money was down in 10th. The competition the following week was relatively light as well. Demolition Man held the number 1 spot as the Beverly Hillbillies came along. $9.5 million for the Beverly Hillbillies. Demolition Man 10.2 on its second weekend. Judgment Night, the other opener that weekend of note, that was down in 5th place with 4 million. And then the following week, the Beverly Hillbillies defenestrated Demolition Man from the top of the chart. So 7.1 million for the Hillbillies, 7 million for Demolition Man. No new openers, but Disney was broadening out the release of Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas at that point, or more accurately, Henry Selick's The Nightmare Before Christmas. And Demolition Man hung around the chart for a little bit. Carl Reiner's Fatal Instinct turned up the week after. Then the week after that, with Demolition Man just still down in 8th place, there's stuff like Flesh and Bone, RoboCop 3, Look Who's Talking Now. I think that might be the best of the Look Who's Talking film. Minority opinion. I'll stick with it. And then we were heading into mid-November. Bigger films. The Three Musketeers. The Brilliant Carlito's Way. Oscar tempting stuff like My Life were coming along. Demolition Man, though, had done Sylvester Stallone good. 1993 had been, in business terms, a good year for him. It did 58 million at the US box office. Not enormous amounts of money, certainly, but the crucial thing is it did another 100 million overseas. That was the power of a star name. You could sell your film around the world. $159.1 million in the end, Demolition Man had in the bank, and, you know, a pretty decent return that was. Many years later, I mean, fairly quickly, actually, there was talk of a Demolition Man 2 that was going to be out in 1995. That never happened. There was then subsequent talk of a further Demolition Man sequel. I think that came back up in 2020. There was also some shenanigans with Stallone and legalities over who was owed what money and things like that, of which I have no say or no information on. I don't get involved in legalities. I'm very cheap. I'm very poor. But to this point, even though there's been rumours of Demolition Man sequel and Stallone hasn't been against revisiting some of his old hits, no, nothing at this point. Marco Brambilla, though, I'm going to leave the final bit to him because, I mean, he walked away from directing Hollywood films after this, and he would reflect, again to the talk, he just said, once I realised the importance of marketing and the importance of everything other than the content itself, I didn't last very long. He said, I just had a sense that it wasn't really fulfilling for me creatively, and I went back to making things that were more personal and that I was more passionate about. He said, I didn't feel like it was a filmmaker's medium anymore in 1993. It was becoming more of a producer's medium. Joel Silver in this particular case. And he said, now I'd say it's not even a producer's medium anymore. It's more of a marketing department's medium. So now the film business has split into these two worlds, very much like the art world. And it's the art world where Marco Brambilla has found his home. Again, Demolition Man is getting this brand new gleaming 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray release. Here we are, like, talking about it, 30 odd years on for probably more than Cliffhanger as well. Cliffhanger made more money. Demolition Man, I think it's just like, not just because it's prescient, but also just because it's very funny and very good. Really just seems to have been, of all the films Stallone made in the 1990s, the one that has endured the most. Can't wait to watch it again.